Rajiv,
So
I think
Rajesh,
it is for you to start now. Nudging valuation biases, technical session.
yes,
Okay. So once again, I'm testing. Is audible?
yes,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So good evening and namaskar to all of you, especially uh, to all people who have joined in the inaugural session, starting from Suresh Prabhuji. And very happy birthday, sir. Today, Pawan Kumarji from IBBI, Anil Sarmaji, Nafra, good friend, a senior guide to us, Avnish Mataji, Dr. Lal, Dinesh ji, all board members, and also people who are other board members and mentors who are hooked with this program. We all uh, are very happy to have you today in the program. We are starting. I'm very happy to see today in this first inaugural session. We are talking about first started with our mentor talked about the blockchain. This is the kind of vision we have to include this artificial intelligence, and I'm opening up with the behavioral finance as a contributor in the role of evaluation. So if we have to match the world in terms of knowledge, in terms of delivery, in terms of quality, I think these are the some new knowledge segment and areas will be very important for all of us to know about. So you'll be wondering in valuation why there is a concept of behavioral finance and what is this nudging, what we are going to nudge into the valuation. To give you an idea, I am a late learner of behavioral finance. In fact, I started from 2002 when Daniel Kahneman, he was given a Nobel Prize and a very seminal work in behavioral finance, and followed by in 2013 was a classical a case where in 1 year you have got two Nobel Prizes in economics with two different viewpoints, one North Pole, another South Pole. So one guy was talking about market efficiency, another guy was rejecting. So I'm talking about Robert Seeler, who basically has rejected market efficiency theory in valuation, and then, of course, using pharma, who said there is a market efficiency. So that was then. Then came 2017. Robert Thaler, he was awarded Nobel Prize. These are a few names have taken who have taken behavioral finance knowledge to a greater height. And I personally believe I've been using these concepts in a lot of practical cases, nationally and internationally. Some cases are turnaround on these concepts, very simple for people to understand, and therefore it is very easy to understand because it requires a lot of simplification in just 40-45 minutes, a very complex subject, but I will try to address and make sure that by the end, when you go, you learn few concepts which you've never heard, and you will see how this is being used. This is what IBVA is for all about. So we will be bringing the best in the world to give the Indian, to make them sure that our valuer compete with the best in the world, because you'll be tested, as Onish Mataji said, your concept, and Dr. Singh also said about that, your concepts will be tested in the courts and your concepts will be cross-examined by various other authorities. So how do we sustain that? How do we understand this? You'll be wondering then behavioral finance role. I'll give you a small presentation in few minutes. So Sweta, if possible, you can put in before I give a little bit of a background of this. We are basically human beings who have got two special qualities. We have got not only a feelings, but we also have a thinking. And that thinking part is something pretty critical. We behave in a certain manner. And if you understand that manner of behavior, I think you can also cross-examine my work. You will be expected, or you can predict my behavioral aspect to understand what kind of output I'm going to produce. So behavioral finance basically helps you in understanding something which traditional finance cannot explain. So therefore, traditional finance, if we contrast with the behavioral finance, will be a totally different dimension. And I remember when in 70s, the classical paper of Eugene Fama, who got a Nobel Prize in 2013, something called efficient market hypothesis came in. I think all people were talking in support of that, but there was some great mind, they were thinking that this is something not possible. So what are those things which behavioral finance discusses differently from what we learn in the standard finance? We, while preparing valuation report or exercising the work in valuation, we believe that yes, standard finance concepts I am following, but I will surprise you today that because of this behavioral aspect which we are going to discuss, you do a lot of those aspects which generally you could have avoided, or you could have pointed out, you could have located, it would have applied these concepts. So I'll go back to give you a very simple understanding, a classical difference between behavioral finance and standard finance or traditional finance is that traditional finance will not consider anything subjective in terms of risk. Behavioral finance will go and consider not only the objective part like your beta, standard deviation, variation while assessing risk, but would also consider the risk, which is something we call it is a subjective. If you ask me, we basically lie when we use in our report and say I am following an objective mechanism like using capital asset pricing model for calculating discount rate. So it ends with a certain level. But if you load alpha factor, if you load company specific risk premium, if you load a small company risk premium, these are basically is an adjustments mostly based on your what we call as a subjective assessments of risk. So assessment of risk is not completed just based on objective data set, and therefore while we are mixing of both together, we say that no, we are not mixing. So therefore you can see in traditional finance, efficient market hypothesis which talks about market efficiency. To simplify what market efficiency talks about is that for a similar assets, for a assets having a similar cash flow, you cannot have two different prices in the market. You understand? As simple as that. Efficient market hypothesis simply talks about, I think there is some background noise. Can you switch off? Please switch off the background noise. The efficient market hypothesis talks about market efficiency, which in turn simply talks that if an asset, two assets having similar cash flow has to have a same price. That is what is a market efficiency. If there is a mispricing or if there is something distortion in this, then a process called arbitrage which will take place and which will bring the prices in a equal to its value. So I'll explain now when we are discussing anomalies between price and value, why price is this, why value is this. I mean, there are a lot of questions which comes in press. I think if you understand this, the next two words it will clarify you. Homo economicus. Now, in a layman's language, the meaning of the word Homo economicus is you are an economic man. So what is the role of economic man? A traditional finance belief that everybody is Albert Einstein, everybody is William Sharpe, everybody is like father of modern finance, Harry Markowitz. This kind of a skill set you have got. You are a rational investor. You can process all information, and then all your preferences will be based on something we call it as a utility maximization theory or expected utility maximization theory. Sir, I'll tell you before I go for a behavioral finance why I'm using this. If anybody has got a spouse, children, bosses, and if you have a modicum of, I would say, self inside, you will agree that this homo economicus is a false concept. It doesn't work in real life. In real life, you are like a average people. We are not a special created man. That is the assumption of traditional finance. So I am challenging behavioral finance to challenge this, and we'll see how it rolls into the valuation, how much of the skill can be used. And then they came out in behavioral finance something called prospect theory. Now, what is the prospect theory? The prospect theory talks about that the human being is having an average knowledge. You're an average person. Whereas in traditional finance, you are taught to be a rational person. A person have got the ability to process everything, has got ability to do something which is unbelievable. You can see what Richard Thaler said about a behavioralist in the next slide. Just show them. The difference between us is that you assume people are as smart as you are. So this is what a traditional finance expert says, whereas a behavioral finance says, means Richard Thaler say that I assume people are as dumb as I am. So what he's saying that people, if you see their behavioral part, the way they make decisions, the information processing, and all our other aspects, I think there will be a lot of opportunity for you to nudge into the valuation. I'll also explain about the nudging. This is now gaining ground, and I appreciate in economic survey 2018-19, if I'm not wrong, the first time in economic survey a separate chapter was given for nudging, or especially the behavioral finance concept rolled into economic survey write-up. So therefore, what I'm saying, it is importance is increasing. So now it builds up. He explains you that what is the difference between price, why prices behave, they do not go in line with the value. Take classical example today. Lot of people keep on asking me question, why capital market behavior is different from the economic fundamental. You'll be wondering, you'll have a lot of question onto this, that why share price is going up when everybody knows with a common average knowledge, not homo economicus. You know that the economic fundamentals are not good, we are not in a bad shape. So therefore, there is a decoupling between economic condition and the condition available in the capital market. So it's a normal human behavior. If you pick up the historical data, you would know that the markets can get decoupled from economic position. And why it is happening, who are the people who are doing this, why they're doing, what kind of behavioral things are there. The same set of people, I would say, when they come and give you a valuation assignment, I think they do the same activity. We only have to catch them. How and when? For that, we need to understand 2-3 critical terms. In the next slide, I'll explain. The first term is heuristics. Now, this is I've tried my best to make it as simple as possible, because this looks very clumsy and very difficult, since I've been able to communicate to top legal brain to justify this. Now, what is this heuristics is all about? It is just a rule of thumb. See, I've given a very interesting connotation of this. If you want to understand, human behavior is to reduce cognitive resources. You must have heard a student say, I'm saving my energy for exam purpose. What exactly he's doing? He should have literally, he's utilized his energy. That is, we call it a cognitive resources, rather than saving them for examination. But his teachers, his guide, they're saying, oh, you save your cognitive resources because it will be used there. It is a human tendency to do a very complex, mathematical calculation in a shortcut manner. So it is a mental shortcut of a very complex issues which we encounter in financial world or in a world of valuation on day-to-day basis. And therefore, what we give a fancy name to the rule of thumb, it is known as heuristics, right? So this heuristics has a big issue, and that by nature, these heuristics
are imperfect. I'll give an example. It will clarify the issue. Because they are imperfect, they lead to biases, and these biases and errors are a critical part of valuation report. So if you have this skill set of understanding heuristics, human behavior, like who prepares the projections, what was his experience, what was his motivation, what exactly he has done, what he has been doing, all these things if you bring in, you'll be in a better shape to understand these biases, and you can prove in the court, you can prove to the regulator that look, these biases are appearing in the valuation report, and if this is what has happened, no amount of calculation is going to justify your job because you have been biased. In the legal term, ask any lawyer, proven bias, you are finished, boss. You are finished. There is no defense for the biases. And so far, very few people are trained to understand these biases. I'll say there is a huge list of biases, but I thought in an opening day of International Business Valuation Association, nothing better than an introduction of behavioral finance concept in valuation in India. First time we are doing. Like our senior Mataji said, we were the people who brought in first business valuation standards in the country with a desire, with a belief that the people will bring in uniformity, consistency, transparency in the whole process. But this idea is also going to tell you in the same footing. So heuristics are going to lead to biases and errors. And if you know that, whereas we are doing a shortcuts, I think you have done the job. I give on a small example. Today also morning, one more course I run at IICA platform where I'm a course director. One of our professor was talking about EBITDA multiple. I mean, my audiences were mesmerized. Now, EBITDA multiple, that means a sum multiple of some financial number, is the simplest way of, multiplying with this number. So the mind, you ask any promoter, you ask any layman, you ask an investor, they will love those numbers. You ask a stock research analyst, they will love those numbers because for them, it is a rule of thumb. Sometimes I get an assignment. The people will ask me a question. Before I give an assignment, can you tell me what would be the likely EBITDA multiple? I say, sorry, this is a folded hand. I cannot tell you what would be the EBITDA multiple. I have no idea. We say, people say in the market, this is what the heuristic says. You will start with this. You will start with this. You have kept this in mind. And then you use, suppose tomorrow DCF, if it is mandatory, and start trying to see that somehow the DCF number should come to the EBITDA multiple. I can challenge you or prove you. I can challenge you or prove you that those numbers cannot be reconciled. But you have reconciled because you had in your mind that this is what I want to achieve. They were given the target. You achieved it by doing something using DCF tool as a ATM card. If there is a shortage, you pump in. If there is an excess, you take out. So therefore, behavioral finance understanding, as I said, is a very, very important concept. And I hope this term looks very fancy, complex, and difficult to understand. I simplify. Heuristics. Remember that. This is all shortcut functioning of a brain. So therefore, in projections, if a management gives you everything shortcut, last year this year this, no explanation, nothing, all heuristics flowing in, all getting infected, your entire projection getting infected. I'll also discuss you later on in next 5 to 10 minutes because I'll finish exactly at 5 o'clock. My very good friend Santosh Malar is there and would be discussing a very important topic on leasing accounting. So and its impact on valuation, will jointly do it. So I'll finish because this topic I just want to introduce for the audiences to understand that what is the biases. The biases can flow from management projection, and it becomes a very difficult proposition when these biases results in a valuation biases. So remember, there are two different sort of things going to happen. One is a management biases with their motive, their feeling, their objective to achieve something, And if it comes into the valuation, it becomes a valuation biases. If you are caught on those, you are finished. There's no end for this. It's very difficult. You would be wondering, how do you identify? I'll tell you. There are ways to do that. But now I'm coming to give you the third term which you need to understand if you have an interest in behavioral finance. I'm sure today, once we will finish, all of us will be interested in knowing all these concepts. And that is what we call as an introduction of the concept. So the third term is the nudge. So what do I mean when I say we have to nudge the valuation, biases? So we have to identify the biases, reduce as many of them as possible, and then how do we do that? By nudging. Nudging is not something giving an incentive for you to do, or neither a penalization of doing. It is just a potential intervention. I use the word intervention. How do you do that? You read International Valuation Standard. It said do investigation, do analysis, do inspection, do all computation. You will come to know that where I need to judge it, and then know behavioral aspects, that how it came in, and then you can do that. Recently, I given one example of behavioral aspect. You can understand how much risk goes into the projections. In US court, it was asked that this projection, a valuer was defending his case, and projection came in. So the valuer was asked that who gave you the projection? So valuer says that X and Y gentleman. He gave a name of that. So the next question was that what was his background? He said he's a economics honors, and what is his experience? So there is what I'll tell you. The third question was terrible. The third question, the opposing counsel asked that what was his experience? The reply was he used to prepare projections for working capital loan. That was his experience in preparing projection. So you can imagine, the moment you know who prepared the projection, you know the background, you don't check it in routine case. In fact, 90% of valuation I've seen when I started, even today, despite standards, people give a limitation and say that this projection is given by management. Oh God, this projection is approved by management. So it's a complete bias pumped into the projection. What is your role then? Have you done your analysis? No. So then where is the valuation? So the next question he was caught in, and he said that this guy has got an experience of preparing projection for a bank loan purpose. The court says that this guy could not have given a projection for a company valuation because that requires a long-term strategic input. Did you get that? Answer was no. So your credibility tarnished. You're finished. You've not done your job. So every element which goes into the valuation, if you go and see what are the elements, what are the areas you have to pinpoint, and from where these biases, you can understand biases like as a varices. How the varices can creep into my whole exercise, and if you can nudge them, I think you have done the job. So a nudging is a process where we do a potential intervention with a intention to improve the quality of decision. This is a very big concept. I'm not going into more detail. I'm restricting for the time being to the valuation profession because it has got a social dimension, it has got a political dimension. That how is a classical example of nudging could be a GPS. It allows you, tells you that this is what the wage goes in, but leaves you to make a decision. You want to go turn around, okay, fine, you turn around. He'll also give a rerouting. That's possible. So nudging is that. You're identifying the biases, telling the people, and going into that. So, Shweta, now I'll give you some of them, which will be very interesting. Few heuristics and the biases are something very important for all of us to understand. The first part I've little bit explained. The other one is the framing, emotion, and market impact, right? So lot of time, I'll ask you one question before even I explain, define. I'm not going to do that. That's not the time. That's not a basically right platform to do that. But tell me on 31st March 2020, was it fundamental working for a share price, or it was a emotion which was working? You tell me. Has that fundamental gone so bad in 6 days when the 24th of March 2020 Prime Minister announced a lockdown? It was like a human behavior of seeking to risk-free assets. And where is the risk-free asset? USA. You go and see all the stock price in USA is rising because across the globe, all people are just liquidating or selling or throwing their assets in various markets and pumping money in USA. So both way, it is disturbing the fundamental. These are the emotional behavior. We'll tell you this is how behavioral finance concepts covers in. There is another question is framing. I think it's a beautiful concept if you want to understand about the framing, ask a lawyer. You frame the question differently, same objective facts given to you. If I frame the question differently, you will give a different result. So sometimes what we do, if I want a X result, I will frame the question in a manner at the time of interview that you give me the result what I wanted. So I'm perfectly parking the biases into this. This is very interesting, and we'll see this impact of all these biases on the market part. These are basically a key 4 themes of behavioral finance. As I said, I will just introduce them. Not all of them can be covered. Few of them I'll cover. We will keep on run a series of program on these concepts, a real life application, and we'll see how in valuation, if we know these concepts, you will be in a position to create a more credible valuation. We can create a more acceptable valuation. That is what is the whole objective is. So just to understand at this stage, we have learned about the heuristics and all shortcuts or a mental shortcuts as a human being, which we do to avoid a complex calculation like a DCF or maybe adjustments. I can give on a classical example. Even in a market approach, EBITDA multiple per se is meaningless unless you've done those adjustments, differences between 2 comparable companies. Unless you've done that, you have not understood the concept. 2 companies can have a huge differences in working capital. A valuation based on EBITDA will give you a very a difficult number or a number which you cannot justify because you have not understood it. You followed it, you copied it, and your mind is, framed. Your mind is framed with that kind of a question. So this is a mind breaking. A behavioral finance helps you to catch all of them. So Sweta, can you go to the next slide? Next slide, I just said, this I have already explained that the framing biases are those where we have a similar facts, but questions are framed differently to give you a different result. Just quickly roll through where I say you stop because I just want to give you some classical examples how we can nudge into this valuation part. After the framing, the nudging part, I'm just leaving for the time being the market impact and others because they would require a lot of empirical data for you to understand that how these behaviors basically results into a price observation. But at this stage you must be clear, because we are a thinking human being, because we are a feeling and thinking human being. So therefore the way we feel, the way we think, it would translate into my action, and therefore we call it that because of your background this is happening, because the way you come out you are doing this. These are proven fact. Your financial decisions are also affected because of those. Can we catch those aspects? In few next slide we can go and catch this very important aspects of behavioral finance. The first important I'm going to discuss is the Sweta, just flip through emotion. Just a minute here, just a minute, go back, and then I'll come back to the forecast bias. And yeah, emotion. Compare the prices and fundamentals. Fundamentals as of 31st March 2020 would have got inputs of your shape of recovery.
you can see my video channel and IICA program where I've said a V-shaped recovery. Now more or less people are conforming. That was then in that point of time, the fundamental value would have come from there, but a people emotion associated universal human unconscious need. Now this is greed. This is greed. That's the reason why people do fraud. That's the reason people do a wrong thing in the market. Fantasies and the fear, they drive the decision. Would you agree or disagree? Tell me. So therefore, all prices, I repeat now, therefore, all prices are not reflective of fair value. I said then, now IVS has confirmed it that fire sale prices are not something which should be considered. But that is written in the standard. You have to understand the behavioral part, that how people react. They see this kind of a data, the fundamentals are thrown apart because you are fearful. The another beautiful part of behavioral finance is that it gives more weight to fear and less weight to gain. Which means if I say in an accountant word, in behavioral finance, you give more weight to losses, less weight to gain. So wherever I see that there is a loss of a enormous amount is going to happen, I will say sorry, I'm not making an investment. Whereas in traditional finance, you will be doing on an expected return, on expected value basis. So there rates can be equal, it can be different. But here in behavioral finance, that's the human being nature. You got fearful that, oh my God, everything doomsday has come and just sell it. So everybody started selling, the share price fallen. Now there are a lot of cookbook style valuers, valuation dabblers. They started picking all those prices, parked in this, use index or IFRS, and said my job is done because the rule says it is a unobservable adjusted prices. But you have not read behind, you have not read down the line, where it is clearly given that in certain circumstances, and that was a circumstances you needed to understand for the purpose of application, where there was a huge element of emotion and it was there parking into the whole activity. It was reflected, it can be quantified, it can be proven. You ignore that. So my question, which I leave it here before I go for further in another 15 minutes time to explain few interesting behavioral finance biases. Do the cognitive errors and the biases of individual and group of people affect market and market price? If you ask me this question in a standard finance, I would say no. Why? Because standard finance says that if there is something mispriced, there is a process called arbitrage, which will take in underpriced stocks will be bought and overpriced stocks will be sold. This activity will continue till the price and value comes together. But behavioral finance says no, this can go on for a very long period of time. And that's how Robert Shiller is one side, and you have a Eugene Fama on other side. Then you have a Daniel Kahneman, and then similarly Robert Thaler. These guys have created a different lens to look together, to see through, given a different dimension altogether of looking prices and values. This is how a value should know. So therefore, standard finance says investors' mistakes in a sense of understanding mispricing, etc., in an efficient market immediately vanishes, which is what not the reality is. So therefore, I'm not saying all the time standard finance concepts are wrong, but sometimes you can understand the behavioral finance and explain the differences between the market approach result and the discounted cash flow result. Rather than doing that, what you're doing, you are trying to bring together to show as if that, oh my God, I have done a best valuation, I have gone close to the market, and therefore average of this is this, and everybody is fine. That's not the valuation, because you have not understood. Now tell me, I can challenge anybody has a DCS sheet which if included or made a result equal to the price available on 31st March 2020, on the face of it, it is biased. You have not done your job. You have done a reverse calculation to back what is available in the market. That exactly is not a possibility where you choose to adopt more than one method. That's my clear view onto this. So Shweta, can you give to the next, because we have just few minutes left. I'll come back to the first forecast biases and forecast error. I've turned out a very classical case on these concepts because a lot of people do not understand the differences between these two. And I'm talking what we can nudge and what we cannot. The forecast errors are basically inherent uncertainty in the prospective financial information. What is the meaning of that? That what we are projecting today, if you compare after that, that is called a hindsight, and in psychology we call it a hindsight bias, right? So therefore, if you compare with something after that, which income tax fellow does it most of the time, some of the judgments are laughable, where they try to compare something which has happened later on to corroborate what was projected then. That is a uncertainty inherent in the prospective financial information. This is not the way to understand. This error is bound to be there. This is going to be there, and if it is be tallying, it will be coincident in few percentage cases. But what we can nudge and what we can look for is the forecast bias. Are you getting my point? These are overly optimistic, overly pessimistic. Now, what is the meaning of that? Suppose you have a thermal power. Now, you know based on historical data that the plant load factor of India on an average is 60%. Somebody can go 65, 70. A normative plant load factor is say 85%. But what you have done, you for next 25 years, you projected, 85% plant load factor. This is overly optimistic. It is a forecast bias. It is not a forecast error. I told you, if you can distinguish between error and bias, you'll be in a better shape. The judiciary will watch it carefully about the biases. This is what needs to be nudged. You failed to nudge. You agreed with something which was you should have rejected. You should have applied your mind. You have not applied. So depending upon the motive. So you have to first understand who is giving you projection. What is the background of this gentleman? In number of cases I've come across, the projections for valuation is different. Projection for the routine board approved projection for routine businesses are different. Can you believe that? Overly pessimistic, again based on the motive. If I want to reduce the share price, I'll do this kind of thing. So the motive of preparers, what is the background of preparer, how he has done that. There are a lot of ways to identify this, and I'm talking about nudging such forecast bias, not the forecast error. Nobody on this planet can even eliminate forecast error. These are bound to be there. They are going to be there. How do you do that? Of bias nudging based on information known or knowable as of valuation date. What is known and knowable, again, is a very important concept. So I hope you will clear in financial discipline. You will be knowing there is a further difference between a forecast and projections also. So for the time, I'm not covering that aspect, but let's go to the Shweta. Next, I just want to introduce few terms. You can keep on. How do we nudge? Say I'm using, there are different methodology. Each one required a different kind of a nudging processes and methodology. But assuming I'm using a discounted cash flow method of valuation, so nudging is possible by scrubbing the unrealistic assumption itself. How do I know that unrealistic assumptions? There are plenty of data in the market if you have done your job. But if you have only taken the number and then roll into the valuation, I think you are not done your job. So you can't do a scrubbing. Or you can create scenarios where the client says, sorry, I can give you only this scenario. So remember, a DCF valuation is based on expected cash flow, not based on the best possible cash flow, which is what typically, this is the bias in the management. Please understand, for you ask any parent how beautiful their kids are, everybody will say they are the best in the world. Same goes into the businesses. So if the motive is to drive the maximum value, you'll get those best possible scenario. If the motive is something else, you'll get a very suppressed details, and you will accept it
that means you are a party to biases. So you can create scenarios and then that way you can reduce, or alternatively, you can make adjustments. When you are doing adjustment, these are all subjective. I said standard finance theory does not talk about these adjustments. They only talk about quantitative adjustments. So, but in practice, we do that, which effectively means some element of behavioral finance is there in the valuation itself. Shweta, can you go to the next slide? So I'll give one classical example. A traditional finance theory says that you cannot earn more than your cost of capital for a long. So effectively, if I have to give in a simple language, the return on invested capital should be equal to your weighted average cost of capital when you roll into the valuation. So what we people do, a Gordon model, you use it. You are fighting on G, you are fighting on cash flow, but you don't test in the return on invested capital versus WACC. If your WACC and return on investment capital are same, so therefore your present value of growth opportunity should be 0. So present value of growth opportunity 0 is a rule, right? Is the rule, and it cannot be an exception. What is very important point is that when this present value of growth opportunity is more than WACC, you would be biasing your terminal value estimation. The higher the return on invested capital in your numbers which you put in your terminal value above the weighted average cost of capital, you have done a terminal value bias. You can do this just by taking the terminal value and reversing it by a goal-seek function and calculating return on invested capital. Compare with the WACC, you will know that how much bias has been factored using terminal value. So why it happens? Sometimes, as I said, remember heuristics, that is a mental shortcut. A lot of people do a EBITDA multiple or some multiple rather than a Gordon model for terminal estimation, but they don't test this, which is more sound and more logical to understand how much I'm factoring return on invested capital and how much I'm factoring weighted average cost of capital into my valuation calculation. So this is what one example I've given for analyzing. Shweta, can you go to the next one? Now, this is a representativeness bias. This is a very interesting bias. What it says that we have an inbuilt feature in our brain to do a fast, a speedy probability judgment, and rather than doing a mathematical calculation, and as a result, we do a fast and frugal decision. You know, data comes in. Think about this COVID. This has happened, and therefore these many people will there. So they will all go in bed. They will die, and this is what we are happy. We corroborate starting. This is what is a representativeness. A lot of problems happen. You ignore the sample size. Nobody asks the question how many sample you've taken, how the sample was taken. What was those kind of things were there based on which you are relying? If I have to use this in your valuation, use this concept. You are calculating beta based on a certain comparable listed company. What is your sample size? Have you thought about that? First, is that sample comparable? Two, is that sample large enough to reduce standard error? Or you have just calculated beta because it is a process to be calculated. It is a, some quantitative data available and I need to calculate, and you want to park it in a capital asset pricing model. For calculation of cost equity, you have a representativeness bias written on the wall. I just have to, show the lens and to the law of quotes and say that, look, this is what this bias is factored into. You put in hell amount of a bias in your cash flow projection, but you have not done a corresponding adjustment in discount rate. This is also very important. This confirmation bias you will find written over the number of pages of valuation report. What is this? People generally tend to look for what you are looking for. So therefore, what is the meaning of that? You want to prove something, you search internet, you find it, you are happy. Wherever you find it, you highlight it, you park it. My God, you don't even read your own full paper. Maybe on the next page something will be written, and that will be contrary to what has been written on the first page, or some contrary opinion will be there, and you have totally ignored up
what you do, you say, sorry, I don't want to comment on this because this will come into the view of somebody, and therefore you will question my judgment. I just, at this stage, let me clarify here. A psychologist would always call it a judgment. I'm not talking for the lawyers, because for them, or a judgment is something else. A psychologist will call judgment, which is nothing but an estimate or forecast or prediction by an economist. I hope you're clear. So therefore, be clear on these terms. So a confirmation bias is first thinking, I want to do this, then finding from the universe, proving your statement and say, oh, it is validated. But you have forgotten, when you will be tested, those things which you ignored will be brought in and your view will be taken. Then you have said, sorry, I can't comment. Or you can say, oh God, I would have seen that. Those things will prove that there was a bias in your report. Availability bias. This is a beautiful concept. We are influenced by WhatsApp. We are influenced by televisions. We are influenced by this guy who comes on television, stock research analyst report. And look at the beauty of the mind, beauty of the brain. It looks for all recent data or a data where you are emotionally involved. That is a availability bias. That means you make all prediction based on only that information. You ignore everything else. Any potential different opinion available, then you are not interested. You have seen something on a WhatsApp and you start predicting on basis of that these many corona patients should be there, these many companies will die. You have heard in some webinar, you have not checked on your own, and therefore that rolls into your mind. That is a availability bias, because you have just seen it, you have not seen history. This kind of a bias will seriously affect the risk estimation process in the valuation, because you are guided by some information which has happened recently, and therefore there is a availability bias. Sweta, can you go to the next one? Anchoring and adjustments is about you're taking a what you call a starting point. From what point you will start and then do adjustment. Sometimes we take a very irrelevant data, say we take a multiple, do hell amount of adjustment into this and try to show it as if it is a very reliable data. So we do you start data would be irrelevant, make an adjustment to that, and then you say this is something I'm using. This is called anchoring. That means your analysis, your conclusion is anchored by irrelevant data. Your start point is irrelevant. I give an example. When you do an expected credit loss assessment, should I start 5 years back? Should I start today? When you do a beta calculation, should I start 2 years back? Should I start 5 years back? All these will have an impact on your valuation. But if you think that I can camouflage, I can fool the people, I think you are mistaken, because this bias is known. So anchoring and adjustment, that also includes hindsight bias. So this also includes your overconfidence bias. So unwarranted faith on your ability when you are not there. Conservatism bias, it talks about simply that how do we, you incorporate, do not incorporate the information available to you, either because you do not have it or you do not have the capacity to incorporate them. You are mostly guided by what has happened in past. I think classical example would be a lot of chartered accountant, if you ask, they answer accounting standards questions, Dr. Lal, if you're hearing me, based on their past experiences. They have forgotten to incorporate the latest development. Same is the case with the valuation. In number of cases I go where I'm told, oh, I read this in something 70s and 80s and 90s and end of this, say, to 19th century. I mean, this is something you have failed. This is conservatism bias. You have to take out of this. Then there is an emotional bias where you do not want to change. This is one of the simplest, I would say, behavioral trap, which all of us know. Status quo. I don't want to change that. I have incurred huge amounts of loss with this project, but I am emotionally involved. I want this to happen. A telecom company from India went to Sri Lanka, start losing, but did not come out because of the status quo bias. So this is the point. Then Sweta, can you go for quickly? Can I take just 2 minutes to finish just 2 more points? Go to the next slide, Sweta. This too, I think, important, and then I'll end it because my dear friend Santosh Malar would be waiting, and I would like him to be there. The first, I want to take the halo effect. Now, what is not a halo? This is a halo effect. This is about a tendency of a human being to like or dislike something. You know, if you don't like it, you don't like it. In some organization, I'll give you a classical example of this. Is a love at first sight. Now think about that. Is that halo effect? So what will be the impact of halo effect, or how halo effect will affect your business performances? Love at first sight is a more of an attraction of a physical appearance of one with the other. Similarly, in organization, if you go and a boss asks you a question that whether this guy is a good team leader, you might be knowing only one traits of that individual, but you present him as if that he is a best available person. This is halo effect going into your work, and therefore the projection. So remember, there is a very important use of this in your valuation, in projections, the way you choose data. So therefore, all these biases which I talked about is equally applicable to management and to the valuer. Both of us are there. The last one is endowment bias, which means you are basically giving more value to the assets where your owner is compared to the similar asset where you're not an owner. This generally we see happening in case of private valuation. So I would like to end it here. Maybe if time permit at the end, some questions from participants would be most welcome. I took a risk of discussing something which was a very, very difficult concept in a, typically I planned it for 1 hour, but it was a 20-minute short by that, but that's absolutely no problem. Thank you very much. Thank you very much all dignitary, board, and all support staff of IBBA for giving me an opening slot here. And then now turn comes for my great friend, Santosh Malar, on a very important topic, which will have a huge impact in terms of valuation of these accounting. So thank you very much, Mataji, for giving me an opportunity for this 45 minutes time.
Thank you, Rajiv. It was wonderful to have listened to another perspective in valuation, and we'll carry on with these kind of new developments. Now, request the next speaker for the next technical session, Santosh Malar, who shall be taking up leases in Ind AS 116 and its impact on valuation.
Yeah. So very good evening, everyone. Thank you, Rajiv ji. Thank you, the dignitaries, for this opportunity. I'm having some with the internet, so if I may just audio, I think it will help from a bandwidth perspective. That's fine.
Yeah, Santosh, you can go ahead with audio only.
Yeah.
If there's a problem with internet. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So, friends, Rajiv mentioned very nicely about the importance of accounting measures like profits, revenue, EBITDA, etc. in valuation, in the context of valuation. Perhaps one of the reasons why we are having this session on Ind AS, an accounting session in and otherwise a webinar on valuation, is because valuation is driven by some of the accounting measures, as Suresh Prabhuji also mentioned. And one of the key measures, one of the key parameters of valuation is the measurement of EBITDA, earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, and amortization. In this context, in financial year 1920, for the companies who follow Indian accounting standards, or Ind AS as we call that, we had a new standard which was kicking in from financial year 1920, Ind AS 116, which dealt with lease accounting. So before we come to the details of lease accounting, the new standard, the background behind this, if I can spend a couple of minutes on what led to this change. So the way it happened was a few years back, Sir David Tweedy, the International Accounting Standard Board chairman, he was traveling by an aeroplane from New York to London. And he realized that the airlines he was boarding on is not actually on the balance sheet of the airline company. So the airline company through which he had booked a ticket did not have the aircraft, on which he was boarding in its balance sheet. And that concerned him, that why is it that such important assets are not being captured in the balance sheet of the companies that run them. And then, of course, he realized that the aircraft was actually on an operating lease, meaning that the airline was not actually owning the asset, but it had leased the asset from another company. So he got a concern that why is it that such important assets for airline companies, aircrafts are very important, and why is it that these are not captured in the balance sheet? So the most important liability, or the most important, so to say, financial liability that these airline companies would have would be the amount that they owe to the lessors of these airlines. So why is it that the liability, the lease liability, is not captured in the balance sheet, but it's only captured in the notes to accounts? So he thought that this is a gap in the standard setting, and therefore he embarked on a new standard setting project for replacing the lease accounting. Before that, of course, as we know, till last year, that is until financial year 18-19, the lease accounting standard required us to distinguish between operating lease and finance lease. So operating lease, when I'm taking, let's say, an office premise on an operating lease basis, the earlier position was that I just account for the lease rentals as an expense, as and when I incur. I don't really capture the present value of the lease commitment in my balance sheet. So this whole change, to put it very simply before we get into the details, is that there is no concept, there is no differentiation between operating lease and finance lease from the lessee's perspective post Ind AS 116 or IFRS 16. The rationale, the thinking now is that when I'm leasing any asset, be it operating lease or finance lease, as a lessee, I am having a right to use that asset for a certain number of years or certain period of time. And at the same time, I also have a liability that I owe to the lessor, that is the company which is owning the asset and towards whom I have to pay lease rentals. So I have on one side a lease a liability, and on the other side I have so to say a right to use that asset, and therefore I should ideally be capturing both. So I should be grossing up the balance sheet. And since I have an asset, it is subject to depreciation or amortization. So I should book amortization expense instead of rental cost that I was earlier doing. And since I would be, as we all know, IFRS and Ind AS, there's this concept of time value of money, and therefore the lease commitment that I have to book on day one has to be present valued, has to be discounted. And since it's a discounted figure that I've captured on day one, I should also be booking an interest cost, so to say a notional interest cost, as and when time passes by. So there would be a depreciation cost on one hand, and also there would be an interest cost on the other hand, instead of rental cost that we earlier had. So that is, so to say, the big change that the standard has brought about. If I can request the organizer to share the slide that I had shared with the audience and display it on the screen. So while the slides are being shared, maybe the if I can, quickly give the impact. So most of the companies that adopted this standard, the impact was overall from an EBITDA perspective, because earlier the rental cost was being booked as a part of operational expenses, operating cost. The impact was that the EBITDA improved on 2 counts, because there is a saving in the operating expenses. The operating expenses reduced because the rental charges are no longer debited in operating expenses. And on the other hand, because depreciation on the right of use asset and the interest cost on the lease liability that is to be booked is presented below the EBITDA, so it doesn't affect the EBITDA. So the companies who adopted Ind AS 116, their EBITDA improved significantly without there being any underlying change in the business as such. And in case of some of the examples that we will see on screen in a short while in these slides, some of the companies had an impact on their profit after tax or profit before tax as well. So while the EBITDA improved, the PAT and PBT had taken a beating.
Santosh sir, your voice is not audible.
Oh, sorry. I think I muted myself. Yeah. So the big change from that, from 116 perspective, as I said, was that there was a change. There was a positive change in case of the EBITDA of most of the companies, because the operational expenses reduced. And the other cost, the interest and depreciation, was booked below EBITDA. But on the other hand, since most of the companies adopted Ind AS and 116, the other impact was that at a PAT level or PBT level, it was a negative impact. Is there any? The shares will be the slides will be shared, or should I try to share the screen myself?
Malar sir, you can take control of the screen.
Sure, let me just try to do that.
Shweta, what is the problem?
Trying to share the PPT. Shweta, it doesn't allow me to share the screen. It says that it can't display content.
Santoshi,
I'm stopping sharing on this side, and then you can share it.
Santoshi, you can just tell me the number of slide, page number of slide. I'll do it. I can do it. Right now it is a
Sure.
fifth slide which is there on the screen. Slide 5 of 29.
Okay, the fifth slide. Okay. Okay, so slide 5 is basically three key concepts is a new standard. One is the things should be considered. Okay, so slide 5. So from as I mentioned, from recognition and measurement perspective, instead of accounting the as is on a monthly basis or a quarterly basis, measure right of use asset and recognize the lease liability at present value of the lease payments. So you can't be doing a fair value of the assets, but you should be doing of your lease liability that you have committed to the lessor as per the lease contract. Subsequent measurement, the ROU asset or right to use asset is depreciated based on the current depreciation policy. It can be WDV or it can be straight line method. Lease liability, it's accreted based on the effective interest method. So the initial discounting happens at the incremental borrowing rate, or if the implicit rate of return is specified or it's visible in the contract. So for example, many a times when a company is leasing equipment or laptops, generally the implicit rate of interest is workable in the contract, and therefore that can be also used to discount the lease payments. So effectively, at a P&L level, you have expenses on account of interest on unwinding of the lease liability and depreciation of the ROU asset. So typically, you in simple terms, you would do a finance lease accounting from a lessee's perspective, and there would be no operating lease or finance lease. It is always a finance lease accounting. If you can move on to slide number 6, please. The standard sets out two exemptions. In case of short-term leases, you don't need to gross up the asset liabilities. You can account for it as an expense on a straight line basis. What is short-term? Anything which is less than 12 months, 12 months or less. Something like which is short-term need not be grossed up. So this recognition measurement requirements need not be applied for short-term leases. Typically, you have furniture being leased or cars being leased for less than 12 months, so you don't need to bother to gross up the assets and liability for such short-term leases. If you can go on to the next slide, please. Now, what is the lease term? And this is one of the more difficult aspects of this standard. That typically in India, you have leases. Many a times you have leases amongst group companies. What is the lease term? So the standard states that non-cancelable lease term is a non-cancelable period which includes the period covered by the option to terminate the lease if only a lessor has the right to terminate a lease. So the term of the lease is not automatically the contractual term of the lease is not automatically the lease term. You start off with the lock-in period, the minimum lock-in period. If there is a lock-in period, that is, neither parties or the lessee cannot terminate the lease during the lock-in period without giving a penalty. In that case, that lock-in period to start with is a lease term. So you may have a 5-year lease contract, but a lock-in period may be of 3 years. So 3 years is the lease term to start with. And then you go on to assess whether there is a renewable option. So if the option to go beyond 3 years is with the lessee, then you need to assess whether as a lessee there is a reasonable expectation to exercise that extension option. So how do you assess that? It depends on, let's say, whether if I'm taking an office premise on lease for 5 years, let's say. There's a lock-in period of 3 years. So 3 years certainly is the lease period. But let's say if I have incurred some cost towards interiors or leasehold improvements, towards the furnishing, the interiors, the the civil work, etc., and I've incurred substantial cost, and I expect that these costs will, this whatever work I have done, interior work I have done, it will last for much more than 3 years. It will last for, let's say, 5 years. So in that case, I have a reasonable expectation that I will be exercising an option to use that office premises for 5 years, and therefore I should determine the lease term as 5 years and not 3 years, despite of there being lock-in period of just 3 years. Because as a lessee, I have a reasonable expectation to prolong to continue to use the premises for more than 3 years, and the lease contract as such permits me to use it for 5 years. Renewal option and termination options need to be assessed. So it also depends who has the termination option. So whether the lessee has the termination option, or whether the lessor has the termination option, or is termination based on mutually agreed position. So if the lessor has a termination option, then ideally you cannot consider that option to be to determine your lease term. Next slide, please. Slide number 8. So what is reasonably certain? How do you assess that? So it is assessed at the commencement, at the lease commencement date, and it includes expected changes in the facts and circumstances between the lease commencement date until the exercise date. So what all indicators are considered? If the asset is of specialized nature, or there is a lack of alternative asset. So for example, let's say if the asset is tailor-made for me. So if I'm hiring a truck from a transporting vendor and the truck is tailor-made, there are certain certain modifications in the trucks, in the truck that the vendor has done for me. So in that case, generally, I would assess that this is a specialized asset, which ideally I should use for a longer term. Significant leasehold improvement. I mentioned that if I'm incurring certain cost on the leased asset, and I'm expecting to have the benefit of that cost for a longer period, then as a lessee, I should consider that factor, that indicator while determining the lease term. Termination and relocation cost. So even if I have an exit option, even if I have a termination right in the lease agreement, I should consider that, for the purpose of lease term, whether it is feasible, it's practically feasible for me as a lessee to change the office or change the, and switch on to the alternative asset. So relocation cost. And lastly, favorable terms compared to the market rates. So typically, if you look at, say, for example, many office premises in a city like Mumbai, many entities or many individuals pay in certain parts of Mumbai what we know as Pagdi system, where it's governed by the old Tenancy Act. So the rental rates that some of the companies or individuals pay is like 50 rupees per month, etc. And these are like old buildings, heritage buildings, which you cannot demolish them as such. So in those cases, generally, if you look at it from a commercial perspective, you wouldn't walk out of those leases simply because the lease rentals are at a much favorable terms as compared to the market terms, and therefore you should consider that while determining your lease term. Next slide, please. Slide number 9. Here's a short example of a lease term. A Limited enters into a lease for a building that includes non-cancelable lease period of 4 years and a 2-year market price renewal option. Before occupying the building, A performs leasehold improvements and interiors based on its requirements. Leasehold improvements are expected to have significant value at the end of the 4 years, and that value can only be realized through continued occupancy of the leased property. At the lease commencement, A determines that it's reasonably certain to exercise the renewal option before it would suffer a significant economic loss if it abandoned the leasehold improvement at the end of the initial non-cancelable period. At lease commencement, A concludes that the lease term is 6 years. So despite of the non-cancelable period being 4 years, in this case, since the company has incurred substantial leasehold improvement cost, it assesses that the lease term is 6 years and not just 4 years. Next slide, please. Slide number 10. So while you have determined the lease term on day one, it's not a permanent assessment. You have to keep reassessing the lease term throughout the period of the lease. So what are the triggers for reassessment of lease? A significant change in the circumstances or a significant event that is within the control of the lessee and affects a reasonable certain assessment on the exercise of the option. Examples are not anticipated significant leasehold improvements. So for example, on day one, you may not have incurred certain expenses on leasehold improvement, but subsequently you do a significant renewal, so you would prolong your lease term assessment. Or if there are any unanticipated significant modification to or customization of the underlying asset. So these are the examples of instances where you have to revisit your lease term assessment on day one. Next slide, please. The second important question is, since you are setting up a liability and an asset on day one is the period that is governed by the lease term. The second important factor here is what all should you include, what all should you exclude. Okay, lease payments are defined as amounts payable during the lease term by a lessee to a lessor for the right to use an underlying asset. So it includes fixed lease payments less any lease incentive receivable. So if you have any lease incentive, many a times, many big for all these theaters, movie halls, and all that, many real estate companies give incentives to the lessees. So those payments will be considered. So that will be reduced from the fixed lease payments which the lessee would have. Predetermined lease escalation. So let's say every year there's a 10% or a 5% lease escalation. So that has to be considered while setting up the lease liability. Variable lease payment based on an index, for example, CPI. So any index which is determinable or fixed on day one has to be considered while determining the lease payment. Fourthly, the exercise price of a purchase option. Many a times, many equipment lease in particular have, at the end of the lease term, they give the lessee an option to buy out the asset at a certain rate, at a certain price. So that price has to be included while setting up the lease liability, provided it is reasonably certain to be exercised by the lessee. What are the exclusions on your right hand side? Variable lease payments not based on index or rate. So for example, if there is a component, so for many a time in all these malls and all, some of the retail outlets have lease rentals of a minimum fixed lease rental and a lease rental, a revenue sharing kind of a model where the retail company shares a certain percentage of its revenue with the landlord, with the lessor. So in that case, the sales-based lease rental would be excluded for the purpose of calculation of lease liability under Ind AS 116. Amount allocated towards non-lease components. So for example, your maintenance or your tax. Exercise price of purchase option is lessee is reasonably certain to exercise that option. Next slide, please. So how do you discount the lease payments that you have determined based on the earlier discussion? So it has to be discounted at the incremental borrowing rate. That is the rate of interest that a lessee would have to pay to borrow over a similar term with a similar security, the funds necessary to obtain an asset of a similar value to the right to use the asset in a similar economic environment. So it has to be lessee specific rate. It has to be specific to the economic environment, currency, and the date of the leased asset for the period consistent with the terms of the lease arrangement and specific to the nature of the security. So practically how it is done, you assess for a similar term. Let's say the lease term is 5 years. For a 5-year loan, what would be the rate of interest that the lessee would be required to pay? And that can be a good starting point to determine the incremental borrowing rate under Ind AS 116. Next slide, please. Slide number 13. So the discount rate, as I mentioned earlier, the standard says that if the implicit rate of interest in the lease is determinable, many a times it is determinable in case of laptop leases or equipment leases, then you use that for the purpose of discounting. If you're not sure, if it's not readily determinable, then in that case, you use your incremental borrowing rate. Generally, in case of office leases or land leases, you wouldn't know the incremental, the implicit rate of interest, and therefore you would fall back on incremental borrowing rate. Next slide, please. Slide number 14. Many a times while entering into the lease contract, there are initial direct costs. So for example, you have brokerage payable to the agent, you have commission, you have stamp duty, you have other legal charges, registration fees, etc. These costs are capitalized as a part of the right to use asset. So many a times, many companies have been expensing out these costs. Now the standard requires specifically such costs which are incremental to the lease. That is, they would not have been incurred had the lease not been there. In such cases, the costs have to be capitalized as a part of right of use and amortized. It gets depreciated over the period of the lease. Next slide, please. Transition options. The standard gives three transition options, and we'll see what most of the Indian companies have actually done. So the first option is on the left hand side, retrospectively restate the comparatives, that is 1819. So under Ind AS, whenever there's a change in accounting policy, usually you apply it retrospectively unless the standard provides a specific transition option. So in this case, that is one of the options. The second option is a modified retrospective application where you account for all the open leases as of 1st April 19. Even under that approach, you have a couple of more sub options. Option 2A is to measure the asset as if Ind AS 116 applied to the lease term commencement. So you go back in history under this option 2A, you go back in history, and for all your leases, you work out what is the right of use asset and what is the lease liability on that date, and you roll back the ROU asset and you roll back the lease liability. The difference goes to opening reserve as of 1st April 19. The second option is more simpler option. You don't have to go back. Whatever outstanding open leases you have as of 1st April 19, you work out the remaining, the balance lease commitments that you have on that day, and you discount it at the incremental borrowing rate as of 1st April 19. And you set up a lease liability and an equivalent amount of ROU asset. So there's no delta, there is no difference that arises under that method. So it's a reserve neutral method under which you will have no impact on the reserves. I have a few examples which illustrate the transition options, but in paucity of time, I would like to spend more time on the practical aspects. So if Shweta, you can jump on to slide number 22 for 22 straight away. Slide number 22. So I've picked up a few examples from real life companies who have, so as I said, this is financial year 1920. So many companies have felt the brunt of this new leasing standard. So here's a reproduction of the financial results, the March 20 financial results from this Indigo Airlines. They gave a very detailed note on Ind AS 116 in their financial results. So basically, the profit, the annual profit for March 20 of this Indigo was what, about 27 crores or 27 crores or rather 270 crores, I'm sorry. And if you look at the impact of the new standard Ind AS 116, as you would see in the last point, the depreciation and the amortization expense increased by 7,900 million and rupees 31,000 million respectively. So that is the kind of impact that this company had. So aviation, retail, all these theater companies, these are the companies who have been very significantly impacted by this new standard. If you can go on to the next slide, please, which is the continuation of this Indigo example. So the finance cost also increased significantly. So if you can focus on the last point here, the net impact on profit or loss before tax amounts to a loss of 9,500 million and rupees 15,900 million for the quarter and year ended 31st March 20. So it wiped out its it's it changed its profit or loss scenario drastically. So obviously for an airlines leasing of aircraft, and one more other aspect to consider here is airlines have their leases in foreign exchange. So if you focus on point number 3 on the slide, that in addition to the interest and the depreciation cost, the company also had an additional foreign exchange loss of about 10,475 million and 15,296 million for the quarter and year respectively. So because earlier I used to account for the lease rentals as incurred, but now since I'm grossing up the balance sheet, I'm setting up the lease liability, and since the liability is denominated in foreign exchange, in addition to the interest and depreciation, I would also have an additional element of foreign exchange revaluation gains and losses, which will also impact my P&L. So that is in fact the third and perhaps the most significant impact in case of such companies. So all the aviation companies, Indigo, SpiceJet, Go Airlines, all the listed ones, of course, they have reported significant impact on account of 116. Next slide, please. Slide number 24. So while the P&L has taken a significant brunt, also the balance sheet has also been impacted on account of 116. So the table below shows the impact on, there's a debt excluding capitalized operating lease liability of 24,000, and against that you have a capitalized operating lease liability of 2,02,849. So the debt equity ratio, and perhaps that's again relevant from a valuation perspective, the debt equity ratio significantly impacts because of this new standard. Next slide, please. This is an extract from the financial results of Pantaloons, Aditya Birla Fashion and Retail, where if you can focus on the table which has been given, which they provided in their results. So they have given an analysis of rent expenses, finance cost, depreciation, and other income, and then finally profit or loss before tax. So on a comparative basis, without having applied this Ind AS 116, the quarterly profit before tax would have been 166 crores, and loss would have been 166 crores. But the actual reported loss was 178 crores. So they had a delta of about 11 crores. So additional loss of about 11 crores at a PBT level because of this new standard. Of course, mind you, because the rent expenses in the first column, the rent expenses is going down. Instead of 319 crore, it's 106 crores. That is a change which is positive from EBITDA perspective.
Hello.
But then from a PBT perspective, it's a negative. Yeah. Yeah, somebody wants to say something? Yeah. Likewise, the annual profits, the annual comparable, if you look at the towards your right, the annual profit would have been 56 crores, but instead it is a loss of 9 crores, and there is a 65 crore impact on account of Ind AS 116. So on a base of, so this is a company which turned from green to red purely because of Ind AS 116. Next slide, please. Slide number 26. This is another industry which was hard hit because of this new standard. That is entertainment. That is these multiplexes and cinema hall. PVR. This is so they also had to apply this new standard. So if you look at the table which has been given, this is again an extract from their financial results. So for the quarter, the finance cost was 32 32 crores. These are figures in lakhs. So 32 crores. So the PBT otherwise would have been 34 crores, loss of 34 crores. But actually what they reported is 68 crores. So their losses almost doubled because of Ind AS 116. Their PBT, their loss before tax doubled because of Ind AS 116. Similarly, on an annual basis, their profits was 231 crores for the annual year. But because of Ind AS 116, there was an impact of 13,600, that is 136 crores. There was a loss of 136 crores. So there was a reduction in the profits from 231 crores to 95 crores. So a significant impact on account of 116. Again, I repeat here, from an EBITDA perspective, it was a positive because the rent, the other expenses, that is rent, there was a significant decrease. So if you look at the bottom table, instead of 32,363 lakhs, the actual reported other expenses was 19,668. So an impact, a saving of 12,695 crores, so 95 lakhs. So while the EBITDA was positively impacted, the PBT was very negatively impacted. And this goes on to what Rajiv ji said, that you cannot have a EBITDA multiple or a PBT multiple on an arbitrary basis, because from an analyst's perspective, despite of nothing having changed, the EBITDA would have improved significantly in such cases, and the PBT or the PAT would have significantly taken a brunt on account of this new standard. So it's important from an valuation and analyst's perspective to understand that why is it that these things have changed so drastically without any real change in business. And my last example, that is on slide number 27. If you can move on to slide number 27, please. Here's another company, Shoppers Stop, another retailer who had a significant impact on account of Ind AS 116. So many a time what these companies actually do is to have more traction from the analysts. They also report their non-GAAP measures. So without considering Ind AS 116 and all these complex accounting standards, they give what is the bottom line and what is the top line, and then they give such a reconciliation in their investor presentation so that it also reconciles to the actual reported financial results. So again, this is a company which had a significant impact on account of Ind AS 116. So that was all from my side. I am happy to, if anyone has a question on 116, I'm happy to take a couple of questions if time permits.
Do we have questions in the chat box? No. Any other friends? They have questions? So I think
as you can, yeah,
please carry on.
No, just to kind of sum up, since we don't have much of a question. From a big picture perspective, this standard helps from bringing the leases on the balance sheets. So otherwise they were disclosed in the notes to accounts in the the disclosure section of the financial statements. Now, because operating leases have to be accounted for in the balance sheet, from a valuation and from the analyst's perspective, it perhaps gains a little more importance. The Institute of Chartered Accountants of India did a bit of an outreach before they came up with a standard, and they were told that some of these credit rating agencies will take this new standard, the changes arising on account of new standard, positively, because the liabilities would now, the lease liabilities would be now captured in the balance sheet. So as you know, we saw that example of Indigo, and now we know that, you know, especially post-COVID, what kind of financial distress the airline companies are generally across the world. So perhaps had this new standard been there, and, you know, a couple of years back, it would have perhaps helped in giving the valuation experts, or, you know, the analysts a bit of an early warning kind of a signal that your actual liability may be whatever, but your lease liability, which you have committed on a long-term basis, is also very significant. At times it can be, you know, 10 times or 15 times of your actual recorded liability. So that perhaps gives a good sense of the liquidity position of that company, and which will now be more visible by virtue of this standard. So that's all. I would like to thank the International Business Valuers Association and you know, Rajiv ji and Atta ji and other dignitaries for giving the opportunity to speak on this.
Thank you, Santosh ji. It was wonderful. In fact, you know, my take is that with Ind-AS in place, valuers have another you know, opportunity to work in. Interplay of Ind-AS with valuation cannot be undermined, and for the sake of, you know, formation of my friends, there is a full standard on fair value in Ind-AS. So it was wonderful, and it was good that you touched upon this important factor, so that the people, the professionals who want to go into the field of valuation, they should understand that what all can be built in the balance sheets, which are off balance sheet items, and accordingly they can take into account while doing the valuation assignments. Thank you once again. Friends, now we are just on the verge of concluding today's wonderful program. Can I request Dr. Sushil Lal, who is chairman of IBVA and visiting faculty with IICA, to just give his independent view, and he, as a chairman of the IBVA also, I would like to hear from them. Sushil ji.
Thank you, Mata Sahab. Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. Respected learned vendor, independent directors, shareholders, media persons, and all stakeholders, and all the participants from all over the globe. IBVA has established by the professional for reskilling the knowledge of the professional. This is the time of deglobalization, digitization, and corporate consolidation. Maximum professional ethics and governance are codified, and these are monitored as well as by the respective regulators. The responsibility of chairman would not be restricted only to the compliance of the codes, but it extends to good practice to develop professional and its quality. Being the chairman of the association, will strictly adhere to the rules and the regulations issued by IBVI and redress the grievances of the members. The association takes the responsibility to admit, develop, monitor, and discipline the members of the profession. The association will discharge its power and functions as prescribed by IBVI. With these words, I conclude and wish all the best. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, friends. Thanks everybody for joining in, and we keep on meeting. All the best. God bless you. Take care. Stay safe. Bye for now. Bye, Fabi.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mataji. थैंक यू बॉस। दिनेश जी क्या हाल चाल?
थैंक यू।
हो गया सब ठीक ठाक? फाइनली मुझे तो लग रहा था कि मैं ही नहीं कनेक्ट हो पाऊंगा।
स्टार्टिंग में थोड़ा प्रॉब्लम हो रही थी, फिर ठीक हो गया। स्टार्टिंग में थोड़ा प्रॉब्लम थी, फिर ठीक हो गया था।
अभी इसको हम लोग डिसकंटिन्यू करते हैं बिकॉज़
ठीक है। हाँ, इसको रिकॉर्ड से बाहर।
ओके, बाय बाय टू एवरीवन। थैंक्स टू एवरीवन।